She was delivered as a debt, but what he wanted was never possession. It was love until no memory of the past survived. Prepare for a passion that begins as punishment and ends as redemption. If you enjoy stories like this, be sure to subscribe to this channel. We post every day. Continuing, the biting wind from the Scottish Highlands carried with it the scent of eucalyptus and the promise of another icy afternoon. Helen Miller adjusted the wool shawl over her shoulders as she looked out the foggy window of the small wooden house where she lived with her father and younger brother Gabriel Miller, who was just 15. Bills piled up on the kitchen table, each paper representing another piece of the family's dignity, crumbling through their fingers. Her father, Anthony Miller, sat at the table with his face buried in his hands. At 52, he seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime of wrong decisions. The farm he had inherited from his grandfather had been mortgaged 3 times, and now there was nothing left but debts that grew like weeds after the rain. "Father will find a way," Helen said, approaching him with a cup. "To have made tea." Her voice was firm, but the tremor in her hands betrayed the fear she tried to hide. At 26, she had lost count of how many times she had needed to be strong when everything around her was collapsing. Anthony looked up, his eyes red and tired. "There's no way, daughter. Maxwell Carver came here today. He said either I pay the £200,000 by the end of the week or—" He swallowed hard, unable to finish the sentence. Helen felt her blood run cold. Maxwell Carver. The name echoed through the region like a dark legend. Owner of one of the largest estates in Scotland, heir to a fortune built over generations, he was known as much for his wealth as for his ruthless temperament. He lived isolated on his mountain property, a fortress of stone and iron built far from the prying eyes of society. "Or what, father?" Helen pressed, though she feared the answer. "He said if I don't have the money, he'll take Gabriel. He says the boy can work on his lands until the debt is paid." The words came out like a painful confession. Helen's stomach churned. Gabriel was still a child. He dreamed of studying engineering. He had a future ahead of him. The thought of seeing him trapped on those cold lands, working like a modern-day serf, was unbearable. "That's illegal," she murmured. But she knew that in the Highlands, far from the eyes of the law, men like Maxwell Carver made their own rules. Anthony shook his head. "He didn't say it was illegal, daughter. He said it was fair, that the Miller family has owed the Carvers for 3 generations, ever since my grandfather borrowed money to buy the first heads of cattle." At that moment, Gabriel came through the back door, his cheeks red from the cold and an innocent smile on his face. He held a math book he had borrowed from the town library. "Sis, did you see I managed to solve that problem you taught me?" He approached excitedly, oblivious to the tension in the air. Helen forced a smile and ruffled her brother's hair. "Of course you did. You're too smart for your own good." But inside, her heart was breaking. She couldn't let Gabriel know about the threat hanging over him. She couldn't let those eyes lose their sparkle of hope. That night, after Gabriel fell asleep, Helen stayed awake in the kitchen with her father, trying to find alternatives. They sold everything that had any value, her deceased mother's jewelry, tools, even the youngest horse. But even then, they didn't come close to the amount needed. "What if we run away?" Helen suggested, desperation tinging her voice. "To where? With what money? And even if we could, do you think he wouldn't find us?" Anthony sighed heavily. "Helen, Carver has influence throughout the region. He knows judges, police, politicians. There's no escaping a man like that." 2 days later, with only 48 hours left until the deadline, Helen made the decision that would change her life forever. The day before the scheduled meeting, she mounted the oldest remaining horse and rode down the dirt road that led to the Carver estate. St. Isabel Estate was imposing like a medieval castle. Wrought iron gates guarded an entrance that stretched for over 2 miles, flanked by tall cypress trees that cast dancing shadows in the late afternoon. The main house, built of lightstone, had 3 floors and enormous windows that reflected the grey sky like empty eyes. Helen dismounted with trembling legs and walked to the main door. Before she could even knock, the heavy wooden door opened, revealing a tall, imposing man. Maxwell Carver was 42 but looked younger, dark hair with silver streaks at his temples, broad shoulders that perfectly filled the dark wool sweater he wore. His eyes were the color of steel, cold and calculating, but there was something deeper there, an old pain he hid very well. "You must be Helen Miller," he said, showing no surprise. His voice was deep, controlled, with a slight accent that betrayed a refined education. "I've come to make a proposal," she replied, raising her chin in a gesture of defiance that masked her fear. He observed her for a long moment, from her brown hair pulled back in a simple bun to the worn boots she wore. Helen felt exposed under his penetrating gaze, but she did not flinch. "Come in." He stepped away from the door, allowing her to pass. The interior of the house was austerely elegant. Dark wood furniture, enormous fireplaces, Persian rugs on stone floors. Everything impeccably organized, but cold like a museum. There were no photographs, flowers, or any personal touches that would make the place a home. Maxwell led her to a book-lined study. Behind the mahogany desk, a huge window offered a view of the mist-covered mountains. "Sit down." He pointed to a leather armchair as he positioned himself behind the desk, creating a physical barrier between them. Helen remained standing. "I didn't come for pleasantries. I came to propose that you take me in my brother's place." If she expected a reaction of surprise, she was disappointed. Maxwell merely tilted his head slightly, as if he already knew she would say that. "Explain." "My father owes you £200,000. Gabriel is just a child. He has dreams. He has a future ahead of him. I am 26. I am strong. I can work." She paused, gathering courage. "I agree to work on your lands for as long as it takes to pay off the debt, but on one condition, that you never again threaten my family." Maxwell walked to the window, turning his back to her. For long minutes, only the sound of the wind in the trees filled the silence. "Do you know what you are proposing?" he asked without turning around. "I do." "You don't." He finally turned to face her. "If you accept my proposal, you will live here under my rules until I consider the debt paid. That could take years." Helen swallowed hard, but kept her voice firm. "I accept. You will not be a common employee. You will be my personal responsibility. You will take care of the house, accompany me when necessary, live according to my standards." His eyes narrowed. "And there will be no turning back. Once you cross that door with me, there will be no more Helen Miller, daughter of a bankrupt farmer. There will only be the one who belongs to me." His words sent a shiver down Helen's spine, but she showed no weakness. "And my condition? About leaving my family in peace?" "I accept." He approached her, stopping a few inches away. Helen could smell his aftershave mixed with leather and something indefinable that was purely masculine. "But understand one thing, Helen Miller. Once you accept, you belong to me. Completely." The way he said her name made something strange happen in her stomach. It wasn't just fear. It was a confusing mix of terror and excitement that she didn't know how to interpret. "Do I have until tomorrow to decide?" she asked, trying to buy time. "No." The answer was immediate. "Decide now, or the offer is off the table, and I will revert to the original plan with your brother." Helen closed her eyes for a moment, thinking of Gabriel's smile, his dreams of studying engineering, the hope that still shone in his young eyes. When she opened them again, there was determination in her gaze. "I accept." Maxwell nodded slowly. "Then it's done. I will pick up your things tomorrow morning. Can I say goodbye to my family?" "You can, but don't tell them where you're going. To them you got a job in another city." He walked to the door. "And Helen," she turned to face him, "don't disappoint me." That night, Helen spent hours awake, staring at the ceiling of the small room she had shared with Gabriel since childhood. He slept soundly beside her, breathing peacefully like someone who had not yet known the cruelties of the adult world. She had made the decision she believed was right, but that didn't make it any easier to leave. In the morning, she invented a story about a job as a governess in Edinburgh. Gabriel protested, said he would miss her, but there was pride in his eyes at his sister's opportunity. When Maxwell arrived in his black pickup truck, Helen was already waiting on the porch with a small suitcase containing her few belongings. He got out of the vehicle and walked towards her with firm steps. "Ready?" She nodded, not trusting her own voice. The journey to St. Isabel Estate was made in complete silence. Helen watched the landscape change through the window. The mountains grew taller, the vegetation denser, the houses scarcer. It was as if they were heading to another world, far from civilization and its rules. When they finally arrived, Maxwell led her not to the main house, but to a smaller building at the back of the property. It was a 2-story stone house, smaller than the main one, but still imposing and well-maintained. "This will be your home," he said, opening the front door. The interior was surprisingly cozy: light wood furniture, fireplaces on both floors, an equipped kitchen, a bedroom with a double bed, and a modern bathroom. Everything clean and organized, but with feminine touches that contrasted with the austerity of the main house. "Has this house been inhabited before?" Helen asked, running her fingers over a wool blanket draped over the sofa. Maxwell visibly stiffened. "That's none of your business." But Helen noticed the way he avoided looking at certain corners of the house, as if fighting painful memories. "Rest today. Tomorrow we begin your new routine." He was already heading for the door when he stopped. "Oh, Helen." "Yes?" "Don't try to run away. This property is over 5,000 acres, and only I know all the exits." His eyes met hers. "And even if you managed to escape, I would find you." After he left, Helen sank heavily onto the sofa, finally allowing the tears she had held back for 2 days to fall freely. She had made the right choice. Gabriel was safe, but that didn't diminish the terror of what awaited her. That first night, she barely slept. Every noise in the house made her jump, imagining if it was Maxwell coming to claim what he believed was rightfully his. But the hours passed in silence, and when she finally fell asleep, she dreamed of snow-covered mountains and steel-colored eyes watching her from afar. At dawn, a firm knock on the door woke her. Maxwell was outside, dressed in dark jeans and a leather jacket, looking even more imposing in the light of the rising sun. "Ready to start?" he asked when she opened the door. Helen nodded, though she felt ready for nothing. She had entered a new world, with rules she didn't understand, commanded by a man who was as dangerous as he was fascinating. And so began her new life as Maxwell Carver's property, unaware that this desperate decision would become the beginning of a transformation that would change not only her life, but also that of the man who believed himself to be her owner. The first days at St. Isabel Estate were a brutal lesson in what it meant to live under Maxwell Carver's rules. Helen woke at 5 in the morning to the sound of knocks on the door. Punctuality was an obsession of his, and delays were not tolerated. "Good morning," he would say every morning, always with the same cold formality, as if she were just another employee. But Helen noticed the way his eyes assessed her, noting every detail of her appearance, every change in her mood. Her tasks were varied and demanding: taking care of the smaller house where she lived, accompanying him to the main house to organize his office, preparing his meals when the staff had time off, and learning to manage the property's security systems. Maxwell was extremely methodical. Every activity had a specific time, every object an exact place. "You are not a simple employee," he had made clear on the second day. "You are my personal responsibility. This means you will represent the standards of this property in everything you do." To Helen's surprise, he had not tried to touch her even once. He maintained a rigorous physical distance, almost as if she were made of glass and could break at the slightest contact. This confused her more than any direct threat could. In the first week, Maxwell took her to explore the full extent of the property. They rode horses before dawn, and he guided her along trails that snaked between pines and eucalyptus trees, showing her the boundaries of his lands. 5,000 acres, he said, stopping at a high point that offered a panoramic view of the mountains. "My family has been here for 4 generations. Every tree, every stone, every stream is mine by right of inheritance." Helen observed the magnificent landscape that stretched as far as the eye could see. "It must be lonely," she murmured without thinking. Maxwell looked at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. "Loneliness is a conscious choice. It's better than sharing your life with people who can betray you." There was something in his voice that sparked curiosity in Helen, an old pain, carefully hidden behind all that formality. "Have you always lived here?" "No." The answer was dry, definitive. "And don't ask any more questions about my past." But Helen was born too curious to give up easily. In the following days, while organizing Maxwell's office, she observed the books on his shelves. There were treatises on agronomy, economics, classical literature, but also carefully preserved children's books and photo albums that he kept locked in a drawer. One afternoon, while dusting the highest shelf, a small object fell to the floor with a dry thud. Helen bent down to pick it up and found a small wooden sculpture, a bird carved with impressive delicacy, painted in vibrant colors that contrasted with the sobriety of the office. "What are you doing?" Maxwell's voice behind her made her jump. She turned, still holding the bird, and found an expression of controlled fury on his face. "It fell when I was cleaning. Give it back." He held out his hand, his fingers tense. Helen delicately placed the object in his palm, noting how he closed his fingers around the sculpture with excessive care. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Who made it?" Maxwell didn't answer. He just put the bird in his pocket and left the office without saying a word, leaving Helen alone with more questions than answers. That night she was surprised by a gentle knock on the door. It was almost midnight and Helen was getting ready for bed when she heard the sound. She opened the door and found Maxwell standing under the porch light, still wearing the same clothes from the day, but with a softer expression on his face. "May I come in?" Helen stepped away from the door, allowing him to pass. Maxwell walked to the fireplace and lit the fire with precise movements. "That bird," he said without looking at her, "was made by someone very important to me, someone who is no longer here." Helen sat on the sofa, wrapping her legs in a blanket. "I'm sorry. My daughter." The words came out like a painful confession. "She was 6 when I lost her." The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Helen felt her chest tighten at the pain emanating from him. And her mother. Her too. Maxwell finally turned to face her. "A car accident in winter. They were coming back from town when it started to snow. The road got slippery." Helen saw tears glisten in his eyes before he quickly looked away. "That's why you live alone," she murmured, understanding. "That's why I don't allow myself to get attached to anyone anymore." He walked to the door. "Good night, Helen." After that moment of vulnerability, something changed between them. Maxwell remained formal and demanding during the day, but occasionally Helen caught moments when he watched her with an intensity that made her blush, and she, in turn, began to notice small details about him, how he held his coffee cup in the morning, how his eyes softened when he talked about the horses, how he sometimes murmured words in Italian when he thought he was alone. One Friday afternoon, while Helen was organizing documents in the office, Maxwell entered carrying 2 long guns. "Put on your jacket," he said. "We're going to the shooting range." Helen had never held a gun in her life, but she didn't protest. Maxwell patiently taught her how to position her feet, how to hold the rifle, how to aim and breathe before pulling the trigger. He had to stand behind her to correct her posture, and Helen was intensely aware of his proximity, the warmth of his body, the scent of his skin. "Focus on the target," he murmured in her ear, his arms wrapping around hers to adjust the gun's position. When Helen finally hit the center of the target for the first time, she couldn't suppress a cry of joy. She turned to Maxwell with a radiant smile, and for a moment he smiled back, a genuine smile that completely transformed his face. "Very good," he said, his voice softer than usual. That night, for the first time since she arrived at the estate, Helen allowed herself to think that perhaps her situation was not as terrible as she had initially imagined. Maxwell was complex, wounded, but he was not the monster she had feared. The weekend brought a different routine. Maxwell didn't wake Helen at 5 in the morning, allowing her to sleep in. He even prepared breakfast on Saturday, appearing at her door with a tray. "I thought you might like breakfast in bed," he said, avoiding her gaze. It was a simple gesture, yet intimate in a way that made Helen's heart race. They had coffee together on the porch, watching the sun rise over the mountains. "Why are you so kind to me?" Helen asked suddenly. Maxwell paused with the cup to his lips. "What do you mean? You said I belong to you, but you treat me with more respect than many men treat their wives." He was silent for a long time, watching the distant mountains. "Perhaps," he finally said, "because I don't want you to fear me. I want you to be here by choice, not just out of obligation." "But I don't have a choice," Helen reminded him, her voice soft but firm. "Don't you?" He looked at her directly. "If you said now that you wanted to leave, that you'd rather I collected the debt from your brother, in another way, would you stay?" The question caught her off guard. Helen opened her mouth to answer, then closed it. The truth was, in recent weeks, she had started to feel at home. The loneliness that had always accompanied her had lessened in his presence. And there was something else, an attraction that grew day by day, fueled by furtive glances and moments of involuntary proximity. I don't know," she admitted. Maxwell nodded slowly. "Then perhaps you have more choice than you think." That Sunday, he took her to see a part of the property he hadn't shown her yet, a hidden valley where a stream ran between moss-covered stones. It was a magical, wild, and beautiful place. "My grandfather used to bring me here when I was a child," Maxwell said, sitting on a flat stone near the water. "He said this place had special power, that it could heal any wound." Helen sat beside him, their shoulders almost touching. "Do you believe that?" "I used to believe it." He picked up a small stone and threw it into the water, watching the concentric circles expand. "Now I don't know what I believe anymore." "Can you talk about them? Your family?" Maxwell hesitated, then began to speak. He told her about Sophia, his wife, who was a painter and filled the house with her colorful canvases, about Isabel, his daughter, who loved horses and dreamed of having a pink pony. He spoke of laughter that echoed through the hallways, of lazy Sunday mornings in bed, of plans for the future that never came to fruition. "Sophia was pregnant when she died," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "We were going to have a son, a boy." Helen felt tears welling in her eyes. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his hand. Maxwell didn't pull away. "I'm so sorry," she murmured. "After they died, I closed the house. I couldn't live surrounded by the memories anymore. I moved to the smaller house and swore I would never again allow anyone to get close enough to cause me that pain again." "But you can't live alone forever." "I can, and I did. For 5 years." He turned to look at her. "Until you showed up at my door." There was something in the way he said it that made Helen's pulse quicken. A new intensity. In his eyes, an unspoken promise. "Maxwell, since you arrived here, everything has changed." His voice was hoarse. "The house no longer feels like a tomb. Mornings are no longer a torture of loneliness." He leaned slightly towards her, and Helen felt as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the air around them. His lips were mere inches from hers when the sound of a branch breaking in the bushes made them abruptly separate. Maxwell stood up quickly, all his muscles tense. "Stay behind me," he murmured. From amidst the vegetation emerged a familiar figure, John, the estate foreman, a 50-year-old man Helen had briefly met. "Sorry to interrupt, boss," he said, clearly embarrassed. "But there's a man at the main gate asking to speak with you. Says it's about important business." Maxwell frowned. "What kind of man?" "From the city. In a suit, imported car. Wouldn't give his name, but he insisted a lot." Helen noticed the immediate change in Maxwell's posture. The vulnerability he had shown moments before vanished, replaced by familiar harshness. "Let's go," he said, extending a hand to help Helen up. The walk back was made in tense silence. Helen felt that something had changed, that their intimate moment in the valley had been interrupted by something that could be dangerous. When they arrived at the main house, they found an elegantly dressed man waiting on the porch. He was about 40, with neatly combed hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Maxwell Carver?" he asked, extending his hand. "My name is Richard Mason. I'm a private investigator from Edinburgh." Maxwell did not shake the extended hand. "What do you want?" "I'm looking for a woman, Helen Miller. I have information that she might be working on your property." Helen felt her blood run cold. Maxwell took a step forward, positioning himself partially in front of her. "And why would you be looking for this woman?" Richard's smile widened. "Let's just say she has admirers, people willing to pay well for information about her whereabouts." The tension in the air was palpable. Helen could see the muscles in Maxwell's back tensing under his shirt. "I don't know any Helen Miller," he said in a chilling voice. "And now I suggest you leave my property before I call security." Richard chuckled softly. Of course. But if you happen to remember anything?" He took a card from his pocket and placed it on the porch table. "I'll be at the town hotel for a few more days." After the man left, Maxwell turned to Helen with a grim expression. "Who could be looking for you?" Helen shook her head, genuinely confused. "I don't know. I have no enemies. I owe no one money besides my father's debts." "Think, Helen. Someone who might be interested in your whereabouts." Suddenly, a terrible possibility occurred to her. "My father, do you think he might have told someone where I went?" "I don't know." Maxwell picked up the card left by the investigator and examined it. "But until we find out, you don't leave this property alone. Ever." That night, Helen barely slept. The sense of security she had begun to develop was shaken. Someone was looking for her, and she had no idea why. But even more disturbing was the intensity with which Maxwell had reacted, the way he had placed himself between her and danger without hesitation, as if she truly belonged to him, not just because of a debt, but in a much deeper and more dangerous way. And the most frightening thing of all was that Helen was starting to like this feeling of belonging to him. The days following the investigator Richard Mason's visit were marked by a constant tension that hung over the estate like a storm cloud. Maxwell had doubled security measures, hiring more men to patrol the fences and installing additional cameras at the property's entry points. Helen noticed how he watched her with even greater possessive intensity, his eyes following her every move when he thought she wasn't looking. There was something possessive in that gaze that simultaneously disturbed and excited her in ways she didn't want to admit even to herself. "I couldn't find out who hired the investigator," Maxwell said on a Tuesday morning as they had coffee on her house's porch. "Richard Mason is well known in Edinburgh, but his clients are confidential." Helen stirred the sugar in her coffee with nervous movements. "Maybe it's better if I leave. I don't want to bring you trouble." Maxwell's reaction was immediate and intense. He stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. "You're not going anywhere." The vehemence in his voice surprised her. "Maxwell?" "No." He approached her, his eyes shining with an emotion she couldn't fully decipher. "You are my responsibility, my property. No one is going to take you from me." Helen stood up too, her heart beating fast. "Property? Is that what I am to you?" For a moment, he seemed to struggle with himself. Then, without warning, he reached out and cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to look directly into his eyes. "You know you're much more than that." Helen's breath caught in her throat. They were so close that she could see small golden flecks in his grey eyes. She could feel the heat emanating from his body. "Then what am I?" she whispered. Instead of answering with words, Maxwell lowered his head and touched his lips to hers. The kiss was soft at first, almost hesitant, as if he was testing her reaction. When Helen didn't pull away, he deepened the kiss, his hands sliding from her face to her hair. Helen felt as if she was on fire inside, all the weeks of accumulated tension, all the furtive glances, all the moments of proximity culminated in that kiss that left her dizzy with desire. When they finally separated, both were breathing heavily. "Helen," his voice was hoarse. "I know." She touched her own lips, still tasting him. "I feel it too." At that moment, the house phone rang, breaking the spell. Maxwell answered with a harsh, "Hello," his irritation at the interruption evident. "John, what?" His expression gradually changed from irritation to concern. "What do you mean they disappeared? Are you sure they were there last night?" Helen sat up in bed. pulling the sheet to cover her body, an unpleasant chill settling in her stomach. "How many heads?" Maxwell got up, walking to the window as he spoke. 25? Son of a... No, John, don't call the police yet, I'm coming. He hung up and turned to Helen with a grim expression. "What happened?" she asked. 25 heads of cattle disappeared overnight, from the pasture closest to the northern boundary. Could it be common theft? Maxwell shook his head. Not like this. Cattle don't disappear without a trace, and the fence was cut with surgical precision, not broken through. He began to dress quickly. This is a message. Helen felt fear tighten her throat. A message from whom? From whoever hired that investigator. Maxwell put on his boots. They're showing me they can enter my property whenever they want. Maxwell, maybe I should... No. He turned to her, his eyes gleaming with determination. You're not going anywhere. If someone is playing games with me, they're about to find out they picked the wrong man. That afternoon, while Maxwell was out in the pastures investigating the theft with John and the other employees, Helen decided to try to find out on her own who might be after her. She called her father from a landline in the house. "Helen?" Anthony's voice sounded surprised. "Daughter, it's good to hear from you. How's work in Edinburgh?" "Father, I need you to tell me the truth. Did anyone ask about me after I left?" There was a pause, too long. "Why do you ask?" "Father, please, it's important." Anthony sighed heavily. "There was a man here a few days after you left. Elegant, expensive car. Said he was a lawyer, that you had inherited some money from a distant aunt." Helen's blood ran cold. "And what did you tell him?" "That you had found work in Edinburgh, but that I didn't know exactly where." Another pause. "Helen, did I do something wrong?" "I don't know, Father. Did this man say what the aunt's name was?" "He did, but I don't remember it clearly. A strange name, Carmela, I think, or Carmen." Helen had never had an aunt with that name. "Father, if this man comes back, don't tell him anything. And if anyone else shows up asking about me, you call this number immediately." She dictated the estate's number. After hanging up, Helen stood in the room, trying to process the information. Someone was using a false identity to look for her, had found her father and was now invading Maxwell's property. But who and why? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car coming up the driveway. Helen looked out the window and saw an unknown black sedan approaching. Her heart pounded. The car stopped in front of the house, and two men got out. One was Richard Mason, the investigator who had appeared a few days earlier. The other was a younger man, blonde, wearing jeans and a leather jacket. Helen ran to the room where Maxwell kept the weapons and grabbed the pistol he had given her. Her hands trembled as she checked if it was loaded. The knocks on the door were firm, authoritative. "Helen," Richard shouted, "we know you're in there. We just want to talk." Helen remained silent, holding the gun with both hands as Maxwell had taught her. "Look, Helen," the voice continued, "you can make things easy for everyone. My client just wants to have a conversation with you. 5 minutes and everyone's happy." "Who is your client?" Helen shouted back. There was a pause, then a laugh. "How about you come out and find out?" "Get out or I'll call the police." "With what phone? We cut the phone line 10 minutes ago." Helen's fear turned to terror. They had planned this carefully. The sound of breaking glass came from the kitchen. They were entering the house. Helen ran to the master bedroom, locked the door, and positioned herself behind the bed, pointing the gun at the entrance. Her breathing was uncontrolled, her heart beating so hard she was sure they could hear it. "Helen," a voice said, closer now, "we're not going to hurt you. We just want to talk." Footsteps approached up the stairs. Helen heard someone trying the doorknob. "The door's locked," the blonde man said. "She must be in the bedroom." "Helen," Richard spoke louder. "Last chance to do this the easy way." The door was kicked open violently, the lock giving way with a snap. Richard entered first, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Calm down, Helen. Put the gun down." "Stay away from me," Helen screamed, her hands trembling so much she could barely hold her aim steady. "Well, well," the blonde man said, entering behind Richard. "The princess has teeth." "Shut up, Mark," Richard admonished him. "Helen, my name is Richard Mason. I'm a private investigator. My client is very keen to meet you." "Who is your client?" Richard smiled. "Someone you know very well. Someone who has been very worried about you since you disappeared." "I didn't disappear. I got a job." "Oh, yes. A job." Mark laughed. "Is that what they're calling it now?" Helen didn't understand the comment, but the insinuation in his voice made her flush with anger. "Helen," Richard continued, ignoring his partner's comment, "does your employer know about your little secrets?" "What secrets?" "About the money you stole before you ran away." The world seemed to spin around Helen. "I never stole money from anyone." "No?" Richard took an envelope from his jacket's inner pocket. "Then how do you explain these bank receipts showing withdrawals of £50,000 from your ex-fiancé's account the week before your disappearance?" Helen felt the blood drain from her face. "Ex-fiancé? I never had a fiancé." But even as she said it, a terrible memory began to form in her mind. Daniel Flynn, the son of a rich farmer who had insisted on courting her 2 years earlier. She had rejected his advances multiple times, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. "Daniel," she whispered. "Ah, now you remember?" Mark smiled maliciously. "Poor Daniel, he was so in love, so willing to help the Miller family with their financial difficulties. And then you simply disappeared with his money." "I never took Daniel's money. I wasn't even dating him." "That's not what he says," Richard retorted. "He has photos of you together, love letters you supposedly wrote, witnesses that you were engaged." Helen shook her head vigorously. "That's a lie. He followed me, bothered me, but I never—" "Helen." The voice came from behind the two men. "Good to see you again." Daniel Flynn entered the room. At 30, he was a conventionally attractive man, with well-groomed blonde hair and expensive clothes. But his eyes held something disturbing, an obsession Helen recognized immediately. Daniel. The name came out like a curse. "My dear fiancé," he said, approaching slowly, "you've caused me a lot of worry these past few months." "I am not your fiancé. I never was." Daniel laughed, a humorless sound. "Of course you are. We even have a wedding date set. Your parents have already signed the contract." Helen felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. "What contract?" "The marriage agreement your father signed to pay off the family's debts. Very convenient, don't you think? He gets enough money to save the farm, and I get you." His eyes gleamed with sick possessiveness. "It was a very fair negotiation." "My father would never do that." "Oh, but he did. After you disappeared, he became desperate. Very easy to convince him that the money you stole could be forgiven if he allowed our marriage." Helen realized with horror that she had fallen into an elaborate trap. Daniel had created false evidence, manipulated her desperate father, and was now here to claim her as property. "You're crazy," she said, gripping the gun tighter. "I'm in love," Daniel corrected, "and now we're going home. We have a wedding to plan. I'm not going anywhere with you." Daniel sighed dramatically. "Helen, don't make this harder than it needs to be. You can come with me voluntarily, or my friends here can help convince you." Mark took a step towards her, clearly preparing to disarm her. It was at that moment that Helen heard the most beautiful sound of her life, the rapid approach of galloping horses towards the house. Daniel heard it too. His expression shifted from confidence to alarm. "What the devil is that?" The answer came in the form of Maxwell Carver exploding through the bedroom door like a force of nature. His eyes quickly swept the scene. Helen cornered, pointing a gun, 3 strange men in his house. The door kicked open. "Get your hands off her," he said in a voice so cold it made the air in the room seem to freeze. Richard, who clearly hadn't done his homework on who Maxwell Carver was, made the mistake of trying to intimidate him. "Look, friend, this isn't your problem. It's a family matter." Maxwell looked at him as if he were a particularly disgusting insect. "Family?" "She's my fiancée," Daniel interjected, trying to sound authoritative. "And you're just her employer. You have no right to interfere." "Fiancée?" Maxwell repeated the word slowly, his eyes narrowing dangerously. Helen saw muscles twitching under his shirt like a predator preparing to strike. "Maxwell," she said quickly. "They broke into the house, cut the phone line. They're trying to force me to go with them." "Force?" Maxwell's voice grew even lower and more menacing. "Someone is trying to force my woman to do something?" The impact of the words, "my woman," was immediate. Daniel paled. Richard took a step back, and even Mark seemed less sure of himself. "Your woman?" Daniel stammered. "She's my fiancée. We have a contract." "She's in my bed every night," Maxwell said with deadly calm. "She bears my mark on every inch of her skin. She belongs to me in ways your petty, obsessive brain can't even imagine." Daniel's face twisted with rage and jealousy. "That's a lie. Helen would never—" "Helen," Maxwell said without taking his eyes off the intruders. "Put the gun down. I'll handle this." Helen obeyed, feeling immediate relief as she watched Maxwell take control of the situation. "Now," he continued, "you have exactly 30 seconds to get off my property before I decide I'd rather explain 3 missing bodies than tolerate another second of your presence here." "You can't threaten us," Richard tried to protest. "We are respectable citizens. We have right—" Maxwell took 2 quick steps towards him, and Richard immediately recoiled, stumbling over Mark. 15 seconds, Maxwell announced. "Daniel," Richard said urgently, "let's go. We can sort this out another way." "No," Daniel screamed. "She's mine. I've wanted her for 2 years. I planned this perfectly." 10 seconds. Mark was already heading for the door. Richard pulled Daniel by the arm. "Come on, man, now!" "Helen!" Daniel shouted as he was dragged away by the other 2. "This isn't over. You're mine, and I'll have you." 5 seconds, Maxwell said, following them. The 3 men ran downstairs and out of the house. Helen heard the sound of the car starting and speeding away. Maxwell returned to the room and found her sitting on the bed, trembling. "Are they gone?" she asked in a weak voice. "For now." He knelt in front of her, taking her hands. "Are you hurt?" Helen shook, her head unable to speak. The reality of how close she had come to danger was hitting her like an avalanche. "Hey," Maxwell said softly, pulling her into his arms. "It's all right now. You're safe." "He's crazy," Helen murmured against his chest. "Daniel is completely obsessed, and my father, he didn't know he was being tricked." "We'll sort this out," Maxwell promised, kissing the top of her head. "But first, you're going to tell me the whole story about this Daniel." That night, as Helen told him about Daniel's obsession, about how he had forged evidence and manipulated her father, Maxwell felt a cold fury growing in his chest. Someone had dared to threaten what was his, had invaded his home, had tried to take his woman. And for that, Daniel Flynn was about to discover that some people should not be provoked. Maxwell Carver was one of those people. The days that followed Daniel's invasion were marked by a constant tension that hung over the estate, like a storm about to break. Maxwell had hired more security and installed an even more sophisticated surveillance system, transforming the property into a veritable fortress. Helen noticed how he watched her with redoubled possessive intensity, as if he feared she might disappear at any moment. At night, he held her with an almost desperate strength, murmuring words in Italian against her hair as she pretended to sleep. "You have to promise me one thing," he said on a Thursday morning as they had coffee in the main house's study. "What?" "That no matter what happens, no matter what lies this Daniel invents or what pressure he puts on your family, you won't leave me." Helen put down her cup and touched his face. "Maxwell, I already told you." "Promise," he insisted, holding her hand against his cheek. "I need to hear you say it. I promise I won't leave you." Helen kissed him softly. "But I also need you to promise me something. Anything. That you won't do anything reckless. Daniel is dangerous, and I don't want you to put yourself at risk because of me." Maxwell didn't answer immediately, and Helen noticed by the glint in his eyes that he was already planning something. "Maxwell." "I already told you that you belong to me," he said, pulling her closer. "And I protect what's mine." That afternoon, Maxwell received a call that changed everything. It was his lawyer from Edinburgh, Dr. Henry Morris, with information about Daniel Flynn. "Maxwell, you won't believe what I found out about this man," Henry said over the phone as Helen listened on speakerphone. "Daniel Flynn has a history of obsessive behavior with women, 3 years ago he stalked a teacher in Aberdeen until she obtained a restraining order against him. Continue, Maxwell said, his voice tense. And there's more. The evidence he presented against Helen is completely fabricated. The supposed love letters were written by a graphologist he hired. The bank receipts are forged. The bank confirmed there were no withdrawals on those dates. Helen felt enormous relief. They finally had proof that she was innocent. And what about the marriage contract with her father? Also fake. The lawyer who supposedly drafted the document doesn't exist. Daniel created a complete fictitious identity. Maxwell squeezed Helen's hand. Is that enough to put him in jail? Forgery of documents, stalking, trespassing, extortion. Yes, we have more than enough evidence for several criminal charges. That night, Maxwell and Helen drove to town to meet Dr. Henry and filed criminal complaints against Daniel. Helen also called her father, explaining the whole situation and apologizing for not having told him the truth from the beginning. Daughter, Anthony said, his voice choked, I should have realized something was wrong. That man seemed too obsessive. It wasn't your fault, father. He's very convincing. And this Maxwell, is he treating you well? Helen looked at Maxwell, who was talking to Dr. Henry on the other side of the office. Yes, father, he is. Do you like him? Helen smiled. Very much, more than I should. Then maybe something good came out of all this mess. On Friday morning, Helen woke with a strange feeling that something wasn't right. Maxwell wasn't in bed, which was unusual. He usually waited for her to wake up before getting out of bed. She went down to the kitchen and found a note on the table. Helen, I had to take care of some matters in Edinburgh. I'll be back tonight. John is on guard. I love you. Max. Helen frowned. Maxwell had never left her alone since Daniel's invasion, and it was strange that he hadn't mentioned a trip the night before. She spent the day trying to keep busy, but the feeling of unease only grew. When night fell and Maxwell hadn't returned, she began to get truly worried. It was then that John appeared at the door, with a grim expression. Mrs. Helen, there's a phone call for you. Helen rushed to answer. The voice on the other end of the line made her blood run cold. Helen, darling, I missed you. Daniel. She tightened her grip on the phone. How did you get this number? I have my methods. Listen carefully because I'll only explain once. His voice had a cold, calculating quality that wasn't present before. Your rich boyfriend is with me. The world seemed to stop around Helen. What? Maxwell Carver. What an impressive man, I must admit. Very brave, too. Showed up alone at my hotel this morning, thinking he could intimidate me. Helen felt nausea rising in her throat. If you hurt him... Not yet, but that depends entirely on you. Daniel paused dramatically. You have 2 hours to come to the address I'm going to give you. Come alone, obviously. If you bring the police or anyone else, your boyfriend will find out what happens when someone interferes with my plans. Daniel, please, 2 hours. Helen, don't disappoint me. The line went dead, leaving Helen alone with despair growing in her chest. Maxwell had gone to confront Daniel alone, exactly what she had asked him not to do. Without hesitation, Helen grabbed the truck keys and headed for the address Daniel had given, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of a small town 2 hours from the estate. Throughout the drive, she fought against panic and guilt. This was her fault. Maxwell was in danger because of her situation. If anything happened to him, the warehouse was located in a deserted industrial area, surrounded by other abandoned buildings. Helen parked and got out of the truck, her legs trembling. The only light came from dim lamps on the street poles. Punctual as ever, Daniel said, appearing from the shadows. I like that in a woman. Where is he? Straight to the point, I like that too. Daniel gestured for her to follow him. Come. He's eager to see you. Helen followed him inside the warehouse. The space was enormous and dimly lit, full of rusted machinery and empty crates. In the center of the space, tied to a chair, was Maxwell. Helen ran towards him, but Daniel grabbed her arm. Not yet, darling. First we need to talk. Maxwell was conscious, but there was blood on his forehead and his lip was swollen. When he saw Helen, his eyes filled with fury and despair. Helen, "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice hoarse. "How touching," Daniel commented sarcastically, "the knight trying to protect his damsel." "I'm here," Helen said, ignoring Daniel and looking directly at Maxwell. "Are you okay?" "For now," Daniel answered for him. "But that can change quickly." Helen turned to face Daniel. "What do you want?" "What I've always wanted." "You!" His eyes gleamed with sick obsession. "Marriage, white veil, honeymoon, the whole fantasy. And if I agree, will you let him go?" "No!" Maxwell shouted. "Helen, don't do it." "If you agree," Daniel continued as if Maxwell hadn't spoken, "we'll leave together tonight. Far from here where no one can find us." Helen closed her eyes, thinking quickly. She needed a plan, a way to save Maxwell and escape. "All right," she said finally. "I accept." "Helen, no." Maxwell struggled against the ropes that bound him. Daniel smiled triumphantly. "I knew you'd see reason. I always knew you were a smart woman." "But I have one condition," Helen continued. "What?" "I want to say goodbye to him properly. 5 minutes alone." Daniel hesitated. "I don't know." "Daniel, I'm agreeing to go with you. At least allow me that." After a moment he nodded. 5 minutes, but Richard and Mark are watching outside, so don't try anything stupid." He left the warehouse, leaving Helen and Maxwell alone. Helen ran to him and began to untie the ropes. "What are you doing?" Maxwell asked. "Getting you out of here." Her hands worked quickly on the knots. "You just had to come alone, didn't you? Had to try to be a hero." "I couldn't let him threaten you. And now we're both in danger." Helen managed to undo the last knot. "When I say now, you run for the back door. I saw an exit when we came in. I'm not leaving you with him." "Maxwell, listen." Helen cupped his face in her hands. "I have a plan. Trust me." Before he could protest, Daniel returned to the warehouse. "Time's up. Let's go, Helen." Helen stepped away from Maxwell and walked towards Daniel. When she was a few steps from him, she said, "Now." Maxwell ran for the back exit as Helen threw herself at Daniel, knocking him to the ground. They struggled briefly before he managed to free himself and pull out a gun. "Bitch!" he screamed, pointing the gun at her. "You'll pay for that!" "Helen!" Maxwell had stopped at the door, reluctant to leave her. "Go!" she shouted back. But before Daniel could shoot, the sound of sirens filled the air. Blue and red lights streamed into the warehouse through the broken windows. "Police!" an amplified voice shouted. "Drop your weapons and come out with your hands up." Daniel looked around in a panic. "How did they—" "John called the police when I didn't come home," Helen said, slowly getting up. "And Dr. Henry must have traced the phone when you called." Daniel's expression twisted into hatred. "If I can't have you, no one can." He pointed the gun at Helen, but before he could shoot, Maxwell threw himself between them. The shot echoed through the warehouse, and both fell to the ground. "No!" Helen screamed, rushing to Maxwell. The police stormed the warehouse seconds later, quickly subduing Daniel. Helen knelt beside Maxwell, who was pressing his hand against his right shoulder, where blood spread across his shirt. "Are you okay?" she asked, tears streaming down her face. "I'm alive," he murmured, trying to smile. "And you're safe. That's all that matters." At the hospital, while doctors attended to Maxwell's injury, which fortunately wasn't serious, the bullet had only grazed muscle, Helen gave her statement to the police. Daniel was arrested on multiple criminal charges, including kidnapping, threatening behavior, document forgery, and attempted murder. 3 months later, on a warm summer afternoon, Helen was on the porch of the main house at the estate, watching Maxwell play with a golden retriever puppy they had adopted. His shoulder had healed completely, but she still sometimes woke with nightmares about that night in the warehouse. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, walking up the porch steps and sitting beside her on the swing. "How our lives changed in just a few months," she replied, nestling against his side. "A year ago, I was just a bankrupt farmer's daughter trying to protect her brother. Now. Helen showed her left hand, where a simple but elegant diamond ring sparkled in the setting sun. Maxwell had proposed to her the week before, a simple but perfect proposal near the stream where they had shared their first intimate conversation. "Now I'm going to marry the man I love." And Gabriel? How did he react to the news? Helen smiled. He's ecstatic. He won't stop talking about how he's going to study engineering with the money you offered for his course. It's the least I can do for my future wife's brother. Maxwell, Helen said, turning to look at him directly. Can I ask you something? Anything. When you showed up at my door that first time, were you really only interested in my father's debt? Maxwell was silent for a moment, a mysterious smile playing on his lips. That's an interesting question. It's a question that deserves an answer. He sighed, running his fingers through her hair. The truth is, I knew about your family months before your father couldn't pay the loan. What do you mean? I used to see you in town sometimes, at the market, at the library, at church. The way you took care of Gabriel, how you carried all the family's responsibility on your shoulders always caught my attention. His eyes softened, and there was something about you, a strength, a dignity that fascinated me. Helen felt her heart race. So when you gave my father that ultimatum, I was hoping you'd show up, maybe even rooting for it. He touched her face delicately. The debt was real, but I would never have taken Gabriel. It was always you I wanted. You manipulated me, she said, but her voice carried no anger, only astonishment. I created an opportunity, a situation where you could choose to come to me. What if I hadn't shown up? Then I would have forgiven the debt and spent the rest of my life wondering what if. Helen shook her head, not knowing whether to be furious or impressed by his audacity. You're impossible, did you know that? I'm a man who knows what he wants and isn't afraid to fight for it. He kissed her softly, and what I wanted was you, forever. 6 months later, in a simple but elegant ceremony at the town chapel, Helen Miller became Helen Carver. Gabriel walked her down the aisle where Maxwell awaited her, his eyes shining with emotion. Do you take this man as your lawful husband? The priest asked. Helen looked into the eyes of the man who had entered her life like a hurricane and completely transformed it. I do. And you, Maxwell, do you take this woman as your lawful wife? I do, and I always will, in all the lives we have together. 2 years later, on a sunny spring morning, Helen sat on the porch of the main house, now redecorated and full of life, breastfeeding her newborn daughter. Sophia Isabel Carver had arrived in the world 3 weeks earlier, a healthy baby with her father's grey eyes and her mother's dark hair. Maxwell came out of the house carrying a cup of tea for her and sat on the swing beside her. How are my 2 favorite women? Perfect. Helen smiled, watching him look at their daughter with pure love in his eyes. Are you afraid? Of what? Of being too happy. Of something happening to spoil all of this. Maxwell was silent for a moment, considering the question. At first I was, he admitted. After I lost Sophia and Isabel, I swore I would never risk feeling that pain again. And now? Now I understand that the fear of losing cannot stop us from living. He delicately touched his daughter's tiny hand. This little Sophia Isabel will grow up knowing she is loved. And you? He looked at Helen. You taught me that the heart can heal, can love again, can be even stronger after breaking. Don't you regret bringing me here? How could I regret the best decision I've ever made in my life? At that moment, Gabriel came running down the driveway, a paper in his hand and a huge smile on his face. Sis, Maxwell, I passed my university entrance exam. I got accepted for engineering. Helen laughed with joy as Maxwell stood, up to embrace his brother-in-law. Congratulations, Gabriel. Your sister always knew you could do it. Later that night, after Gabriel had returned to the city and little Sophia slept peacefully in her crib, Helen and Maxwell lay in the bed they had now shared for over 2 years. What are you thinking about? He asked, tracing lazy circles on her arm. How it all started. You said I belonged to you. And you do. And you? To whom do you belong? Maxwell pulled her closer, kissing her forehead. To you, Helen, body, soul, and heart. Forever. Outside the window, the mountains of the Scottish Highlands stretched under the moonlight, silent witnesses to a love story that had been born of despair and blossomed into something stronger and more beautiful than either protagonist could have imagined. Helen had arrived at that estate as a desperate woman trying to save her family. Now, years later, she was a beloved wife, devoted mother, and integral partner in one of the region's most prosperous properties. She had found not only a husband, but her true home, her place in the world. And Maxwell, the man who had lived 5 years as a ghost, haunted by past losses, had rediscovered not only the capacity to love, but the courage to build a future. Helen had not merely filled the void in his life, she had created an entirely new life. In the silent mountains of the Scottish Highlands, where the wind carried stories of past and future generations, 2 wounded souls had found healing in each other. And that night, as they slept embraced with their daughter in the next room, and their dreams intertwined with promises of happy tomorrows, St. Isabel Estate had finally become what it was always meant to be. A home where love had conquered fear, and where 2 hearts had learned that belonging to each other was not a prison, but the purest form of freedom.